Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last session of the day. I know it's been a really enjoyable and stimulating day so far, and we're going to try and keep the energy levels up with, first of all, the presentation from me. I'm Hayaatun Sillem, the Chief Executive at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and then a brilliant discussion, I am sure, that will be hosted by Megan, who's going to introduce herself in a little while. So, I would like to focus in on the theme for this session, which is really to do with the image challenge and how we can present careers differently to women. And I'm going to do that by zooming, first of all, into my personal career story, and then zooming right out to look at the big picture. And then we're going to wrap it up with what my 12-year-old daughter would call some proper inspo. So that hopefully will be good. It sounds better when it comes from her. And then we're going to have a discussion. So let's crack on. Well, I don't know about you, but I've often been in rooms where people in STEM chuckle about those early signs that they were budding scientists and engineers. I was not one of those people. As a child, I had absolutely no idea that I was destined for a career in STEM. I was not one of those children who's always asking why, who was dismantling everything, loved chemistry sets, none of that. And it was only really when I was choosing my A-levels that I finally alighted on the idea that I wanted to be a medical researcher. I wish I could point you to some epiphany. There wasn't one. I had no role models, no scientists and engineers in my family, didn't really know what the job would involve. I guess I just had a bit of a gut instinct, and I was lucky enough to have parents that were happy to humour that. But despite this rather tentative start, that was actually the opening of the door to the first chapter of my career. So I succeeded in getting a place to study biochemistry at Oxford, and after the initial shock, and it was a shock, of getting to grips with what felt like a totally foreign language, which is, of course, the deep technical language of science, I realised I'd actually found something that I really loved. As I laid down the foundation of knowledge about how our bodies worked at the level of the cell and the molecule, I realised that my connection with the subject was getting deeper and deeper. It was like being given this sort of portal into this otherwise extraordinary hidden world that exists inside all of us and actually makes us who we are. I went on to do a PhD at a research institute that was run by Cancer Research UK. It's a forerunner of the Francis Crick Institute, if you've heard of that. And the focus of my research was on how cells process signals that arise when a virus invades your body. Now, of course, following COVID, many more people know why that matters than did all those years ago when I was doing my PhD. And while there were daily challenges involved in a PhD student, it was a truly stretching experience. I actually felt incredibly lucky to be doing something I loved. Because being a research scientist is an immensely privileged career. The idea I could spend my days on a treasure hunt for knowledge that could help to one day influence our understanding of cancer was pretty amazing. It was intellectually scintillating, I do not exaggerate, and extremely creative, contrary to the popular narrative surrounding STEM careers. But unfortunately, fulfilled as I was trotting along my chosen career path, I was about to hit a massive pothole in the road, because at the end of the PhD, I had to take an abrupt and totally unplanned change of direction, because I had developed very severe chemical sensitivities, which meant that I could no longer work in a lab. And I will not lie to you, it was a deeply disconcerting experience to realise the career I had been utterly committed to was not really an option anymore. But that's when I learned that while STEM subjects seem to be inherently about specialisation, they actually provide you with a wonderful foundation to do all sorts of things that you might never have imagined. So I embarked on chapter 2 of my career by stumbling, and I use the word advisedly, into the world of science and engineering policy. And I'll confess that when I took up my first role in this field, which was as an engineering policy advisor, I had an embarrassingly shaky grasp of both policy and engineering, and will be forever grateful to the people who hired me nonetheless. But I'm delighted to say that this chapter also turned out to be immensely rewarding and interesting. So within my first few years, I had worked on an extraordinary range of topics. How should emerging technologies from nanotechnology to cloning be regulated? And how should we engage the public in making decisions about this? How should the government's system for classifying illegal drugs evolve? Is it truly based on the scientific evidence? What's the future of forensic science in this country? How can we help juries to better understand forensic evidence? And what role should carbon capture and storage play in reducing our carbon emissions? They were just a few of the topics that I spent time on in those early days. And during this chapter, I worked with both technical experts and policymakers, so MPs, peers, government ministers, civil servants, to provide advice on these topics. And whilst, as you will have gathered, most of these are a long way from my own technical specialism at that time, I would have really struggled to translate the technical inputs into well-crafted policy advice without my scientific foundations. Plus, I dined out on my stories from the House of Commons for years. And if you want to know more about those, you have to come see me afterwards. So from here, I embarked on the next phase of my career, which saw me focus on the role of STEM and, in particular, engineering in international development. We often think about the important role that doctors and healthcare workers play in saving lives in developing countries. But it's sometimes said that in the aftermath of a disaster, an engineer is worth 10 doctors, with no disrespect intended to my medical colleagues. This is not a competition. But it's because the engineers are the ones who can stabilize buildings, who can restore communications networks, and who can provide shelter, clean water, and electricity, which are, of course, incredibly urgent in the aftermath of any disaster situation. Then in 2018, I became the Chief Executive of the Royal Academy of Engineering. Not all of you will have heard of us before. We are a charity focused on delivering public benefit from engineering excellence and technology innovation. And we're one of the UK's 4 national academies. And as such, we have a leadership role, excuse me, please, to play in the engineering and technology community, and also provide independent expert advice to government and policymakers. We're also a fellowship, so we elect engineers from across industry and academia, covering everything from engineering biology through to bridge engineering, AI to materials, clean tech to medtech. I'm also the Chief Executive of the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering Foundation, which is a subsidiary of the Academy, which runs the world's most prestigious engineering prize, the Nobel Prize for Engineering. Of course, we don't call it that. And I also do quite a few non-executive roles alongside those. So, for example, I chair the government's Business Innovation Forum alongside the Science Minister. I've been a trustee of lots of different charities, including currently the charitable foundation set up by the Formula One driver Lewis Hamilton, which followed on from the experience of co-chairing a commission with him during the pandemic to improve the representation of black people in UK motorsport. And I'm also the non-exec director at a large construction company. So the reason I'm telling you all this is not because I just love reciting my biography, I promise you, but it's because when I embarked on my STEM journey, I had absolutely no idea of the world of opportunity that my decision to do STEM at university would open up for me. STEM is not just a ticket to enable you to get to a particular destination. It's a passport that can enable you to go to a myriad of different destinations and to reinvent yourself many times over. And bearing in mind that whilst nobody knows for sure what the world of work is going to look like in the future, one thing pretty much everyone agrees on is that we will not have these linear career paths where we start in one role and we leave school, college, or university and just simply progress along it until we retire. We're going to have career chapters. We're going to have to continuously upgrade our skills. We're going to have more career pivots, that was mentioned earlier, career transitions. And that's all going to be a much more normal feature of our working lives. And personally, as someone who's got a rather low boredom threshold, I'm quite excited about that. I can't think of anything worse than being asked to stay in my lane for a career of 50+ years. That's terrifying. So I've described a bit about my external career journey, and I'm just going to give you a little peek into my interior career journey. It so happens that I grew up in a family with a very complex and multi-layered ethnic, cultural, religious background. So some of my earliest memories are literally about how I'm supposed to talk or behave or even dress in different situations. I have always been acutely aware that I am visibly different from most others in the group that I am in, almost wherever I am. And the way I dealt with this was to get very good at finding points of commonality with people, making them feel comfortable with me. I tried to sort of minimize that sense of difference that I was so aware of. And in the process, without realizing it, I knocked the corners off myself. I'm embarrassed to say I genuinely only realized I was doing this in my 30s. I was a late developer. And of course, once I realized, I began to ask myself, is this the right thing to do? And in particular, as I became more senior, I realized that my own self-censoring was making it more difficult for those around me to express their identity without inhibition. But as so often is the case, what felt like vulnerabilities can often turn out to be superpowers. Because as I developed, I realized that my awareness that the world looks different depending on where you're standing made it easier for me to be empathetic towards people from other groups. And empathy is an extraordinarily powerful leadership skill, especially if you want to create an inclusive culture where every single person can feel welcome and safe and valued and able to contribute to the full. And why would anybody not want that? And over time, I've come to the realization that actually, where I can make most difference is where I am most different. And perhaps that has something to do with why I've ended up in the world of engineering. Because, as you heard from Chi, and to my great frustration, this remains a profession where women are heavily underrepresented, currently 16.5% of the UK engineering profession, and sadly there are many other diversity deficits that I'm not going to have time to go into now. It's therefore perhaps not going to come as a surprise to you that I was the first woman and the first person from a minority ethnic group to be appointed as CEO of the Academy. What may be slightly more surprising is that I was also the first person for at least 25 years to be appointed to the role who wasn't a rear admiral or a brigadier. There are many dimensions of diversity. So when I was appointed, you can imagine I had the daily experience of people asking me what it is I did at the Academy and then seeing them hastily rearrange their facial expressions to mask their surprise when it turned out that I was the CEO. And having said that, I think it's always really important. I really believe we need to retain our humility when we think about inclusion. And I'm just going to give you a very brief anecdote that reminded me personally of the importance of this. And that's that one day I went into a room where I was going to chair a meeting, and I went to get myself a cup of tea. And there was a man standing by the table who said, "Oh, good, there's someone here to pour the coffee." And, this is not an unusual scenario. I've been mistaken many times for somebody who is in our hospitality team. And I was not in the mood to make a scene, so I simply said, "Well, I'm having tea, the coffee is there." And he went to help himself. And then I realized at that point that he had a disability that meant he needed assistance pouring the coffee. He had made an assumption about me, and I had made one right back about him. And it was a very sobering reminder that we all make assumptions all the time. But more broadly, actually, if I'm honest, the experience of seeing people's surprise and even confusion at realizing that I'm the CEO has a real upside. Because it means that every single time somebody goes through that process, it means that every single day, just by doing my job and being good at it, I was helping to change perceptions of what a leader in engineering looked like. And actually, that's a really empowering feeling. My appointment also created a lot of interest. And that gave me a unique platform to try to effect change. So to my great surprise, I went from someone who'd spent the best part of my life trying to camouflage my differences to actually leveraging them in order to try to contribute to systemic change. So I think we're ready now to zoom out to that big picture. The framing today is, of course, women in STEM, and STEM can be a very useful shorthand. But it's vital to recognise that the challenges and opportunities in the lessons across STEM vary considerably. This slide shows that while we definitely have work to do, I completely acknowledge in terms of progression of women in different disciplines, actually there's a pretty good gender balance if you look at first-year entrance to STEM subjects as defined by HESA. But the balance is achieved, because women are overrepresented in some subjects and heavily underrepresented in engineering, technology, and computing. And I'd just like to point out that actually there's not a massive difference in the A-levels, huge overlap in the A-levels that you need to go on and do medicine or veterinary science and engineering. And also that I could have had an exactly analogous career as a biomedical engineer to the one I had as a biomedical scientist. But that is not playing out in these statistics. And I'd also like to say that we languish towards the lower half of international league tables in terms of the gender diversity of our engineering cohort at university. I do just want to acknowledge that engineering technology employers also have work to do. I'm not going to spend most of my time talking about this, but before I go back to the why are we in this situation, I just want to point out that there's absolutely an onus on the engineering community to make sure that they provide welcoming, inclusive, and equitable cultures. And this is another strand of the Academy's work that I won't talk about. So this slide here is just a snapshot of some of the recent research we've conducted looking at the culture in engineering. And whilst we can undoubtedly see progress, what you also see is that the picture is really mixed, and there are still some qualities that are going to help us if we can dial them up to attract and retain women in engineering. Let's return to the question of why women are not choosing engineering to a greater extent. And I thought this slide illustrated that challenge rather well. It's data from independent market research that we commission on a regular basis, and it involves asking UK teenagers to say whether they agree with certain statements. There are lots of positive things in this, lots of positive sentiments about engineering. Take a look for a moment at that final row I've highlighted, if you can see it. And for those that can't see it, I'll tell you what it says. It says that nearly half of all teenagers today, both male and female, think that engineering is more for men than women. What? It's an era where we've made so much progress in terms of gender stereotyping. I find this extraordinary and horrifying. But sadly, whilst it's horrifying, it's not necessarily surprising to those of us working in this field. So in the UK, we have this amazingly outdated, narrow, and gendered view of what engineering is and who it's for. This slide is, unfortunately, a brilliant example of the reductive, lazy visual shorthand that we have for engineering. It's a screenshot of a Google image search that we captured a few years ago. So it was in the early stages of a campaign that I'm going to talk about a bit more. And what you saw when we were at the very start of the campaign is literally a sea of only men in high-vis jackets and hard hats, where there was greater diversity in the colour of the hard hat than in any of the people wearing it. I'm not exaggerating for comic effect, I promise. I also find that the autocomplete suggestions at the bottom are a really weird and quite funny insight into what people search for in relation to engineering. So I'm being humorous here, but actually this is deadly serious. It's ridiculous. Engineers shape the world we live in a very profound way. They design, they deliver, they maintain the infrastructure, both digital and physical, that we all rely on every single day of our lives, whether we realize it or not. Engineering jobs are well paid, they are rewarding, they have high job satisfaction levels, they're future shaping, they're more resilient to technological change than many, many jobs that we now have to think about. The data also show us that there is a high job satisfaction level amongst women who do progress in engineering careers. So we haven't just sat on our hands bemoaning this. At the start of 2018, the Academy launched its This Is Engineering campaign to try to overturn these outdated perceptions of engineering by shining a light on real early career engineers doing real engineering. And what was different about this campaign is that we took a digital marketing-led approach. Now, that may not sound very radical to you, but trust me, much of the time, people in our world think, well, we know what's great about it, let's just tell everybody. Well, we flipped that on its head, and we said there are people who spend their lives marketing ideas and brands to young people day in, day out. Tell us, what do you do with engineering? And it involved us being absolutely audience-led. So I had quite entertaining conversations where I had to tell all these senior people that it's lovely to hear what you think of it, but it's absolutely of no relevance whatsoever. This is not about you. So it's targeted at teenagers. And I'm delighted to say that this marketing-led approach is starting to pay off. So since launching, the videos have been viewed over 63 million times by a gender-balanced audience of UK teenagers. The image library that we produced, it's free to access, showing engineers doing real engineering, and spoiler alert, they are not all wearing hard hats, has been extremely popular with more than 3.5 million downloads of the images to date. And really importantly, we now have the first data to show that there are people at university today studying engineering who've been influenced by the campaign. Of those surveyed recently who'd seen the campaign, 25% of them said that it had influenced their career choice. And it's a point of personal satisfaction to me that though, as a result of our campaign, you can now see a more gender-balanced view of people in hard hats when you do the Google image search. And if anyone knows how to fix a hard hats problem, please tell me. But, you know, actually, we have a lot of work to do. And I would like to take this opportunity to ask for your help in challenging these outdated perceptions of engineering that prevent so many people, not least women, seeing themselves in these careers. So on the 1st of November, it's National Engineering Day. It's a National Awareness Day to highlight the role that engineers play in improving our lives. There are loads of simple ways to get involved. So please do check it out and support us. We would really appreciate it. And everything in the campaign is open access. Anybody can use our videos. It's really simple to find. So before I finish, I just want to bring this all to life by giving you a whistle-stop tour of some of the women in engineering who inspire me. And actually, I think this relates a little bit to the points made earlier about sometimes a sense of lack of confidence or isolation of being somebody who's in a minority. I think it's incredibly important to recognise that role models might be sitting in the seat opposite you, and actually peer networks are so powerful for giving you courage and reassurance and moral support. And some of these people here are not necessarily household names yet, but they are all awesome women who have made my life better, and I want to just share very briefly something about each of them. Inas Abu-Hamid is a brilliant chemical engineer, entrepreneur and activist who's pioneering hydrogen storage to power a clean energy revolution. Professor Karen Holford is the Vice-Chancellor of Cranfield University, leading mechanical engineer, but also a really great, progressive, inclusive leader. The awesome Caroline Hargrave, who is so understated you would never know that she was the innovator behind the first digital twin in Formula One, and she's now the CTO at Ceres Power, another really innovative clean tech company. Yewande Akinola, she's an extraordinary engineer, communicator, and human being who presents on TV and runs a summer school to give aspiring engineers around the world access to online work experience and training. Dervalyn Mitchell, most senior woman in construction, deputy chair of AHRC, and a wonderful advocate for engineering as a creative endeavour. Elspeth Finch, equally brilliant as an advocate for creative engineering, talented serial entrepreneur who founded her first company in her early 20s and is now scaling her second in her mid-40s. She was in between the innovation director at engineering giant Atkins, Professor Maya O'Neill, who is a world-leading cybersecurity pioneer, who is the youngest ever professor to be appointed at Queen's University Belfast. Nike Falayan, who, whilst holding down a full-on day job as a telecoms engineer, also founded and scaled the absolutely brilliant Association for Black and Minority Ethnic Engineers, now the leading organisation in that space. And finally, the wonderful Alice Bunn, CEO of IMEC-E and President of UK Space, who I'm also proud to call a friend. Tell me now, please, do you need any more proof that women in engineering are smashing it? It's amazing. There are so many people out there every day doing awesome things. So finally, let me just finish by trying to distill out some of the takeaways that I hope I have left with you today. Firstly, STEM jobs are human-centric jobs. They are creative jobs. Please, can we put to bed forever this awful false dichotomy between STEM and creatives? Secondly, the world of work is changing fast, and we need to think about career chapters rather than linear career paths. Thirdly, STEM is a passport, not a ticket. It can help you access multiple career opportunities, which is what we're going to need in this much more flexible future that we face. Fourthly, please, can you help us get the message out there that engineering is for everyone? We need your help. And finally, a personal reflection. Don't be put off by going to places where you feel like you will be in a minority, because in my experience, sometimes you can make most difference where you are most different. Thank you for listening.
I want to move around the circle and get each of you to introduce yourselves. Of course, we've already had a great introduction for you.
So my name is Natalia Narożańska. I'm the lead simulation engineer designing electric motors at Evolito. So my job is actually a blend of physics and engineering. I do electromagnetic analysis and size the electromagnetic components of the motor to ensure the performance, optimize the efficiency, and then the mechanical engineers take it on and worry how to actually make it and build it. So it's a career that's kind of in between. And what got me into STEM, I think I have to give full credits to my troublesome brother. Because we shared a room, we're very close in age. And I was, on a track to be a good girl, princesses, Barbies, dolls, and all that. He, whenever I was playing, he wouldn't let my dolls just have a normal life, So problem solving and problem solving under pressure was very early on a theme in my life, because whenever we would start a tea party, there would be a herd of dinosaurs attacking the Barbie house. And so then we kind of negotiated that the Barbies have tamed the dinosaurs and they're kind of there as pets. So then the aliens would come, of course, to stir it up a little, because you can't just have it normal. So then Barbies would figure out how to cook plutonium, because I knew about Marie Curie Skłodowska from very young age. She is from Poland. And then to make an atomic bomb, and we kind of negotiated that way of working. But really looking back at it, it was very early on that that play that got me into problem solving. So initially I wanted to be a doctor. Then I broke the news to my dad that, look, I want to go into physics. And he was like, well, are you sure? Nobody's going to treat you seriously. What are you going to do? Be a teacher? No, I want to go into research. Well, that's not going to work here. And it was coming from a loving place. He didn't want me to go through that, all that pain. But with all the language about women in STEM being a little bit ballistic, you know, where it's like fighting, proving, overcoming, with an experience of cooking plutonium and taming dinosaurs, like what could be a challenge. So that's how I ended up doing what I'm doing, and in a series of really lucky coincidences got me to where I am.
Oh, amazing. Your work sounds fantastic. I'm Dr. Kerry McInerney. I'm an AI ethicist at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. I'm actually an arts and humanities major in disguise. I definitely feel a little bit out of place here, but no, I do a lot of work on kind of gender, race, and AI, and trying to think about what future kind of social and political impacts of AI could be. And so my workplace is super interdisciplinary. I work with people like myself who are from more arts and humanities backgrounds, all the way through to computer scientists, engineers, biologists. And I think, you know, AI is a really great example of why there is, you know, such a kind of rich future, I guess, for different kinds of science and humanities disciplines, especially when it comes to collaborative work. So I loved everything that you had on your last slide around thinking about these chapters going forward, because this is certainly never a job I could have predicted that I would have ended up in.
And I'll just end by introducing myself. So I'm the fellow in engineering, Megan Davies-Wykes, and I'm also the head of the diversity committee in the engineering department, and I led our Silver Athena Swan Award when about 2 years after I started my academic role. Yeah, I think I found it interesting, like trying to change people's views of engineering within the environment that I have sort of some level of power over. I wondered, like, what stages do you think are most important for getting more women into engineering? You talked about specifically like pre-A-level students and kind of targeting them at that point in their kind of educational career. How do you end up with more women doing engineering by the time they get to that career stage?
Go on, you guys go first, because I've had a lot of airtime.
So I think leading to what I was talking about, I strongly believe this is the first years. And like on the first panel, we had about different motives when you're planning your life as a girl. That theme of helping people, it actually quite struck me, because I never really, even when I considered medicine, it wasn't about helping people. It was about the uncertainty, the adventure, something that for a lengthy introduction, my brother introduced me to. So I think the importance of play, and something that Dame Jocelyn touched upon very, very early in our conversations, how we advertise the toys, what we're expecting the play to look like, it's really shaping everything down the line.
Do you feel like part of the sort of route we need to take is about how we talk about engineering as a career, like how we describe engineering, as was talked about quite a lot during this last talk, sort of how the sort of variety of different jobs that you can end up in is important. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think this point around sort of where should the interventions come and where they're most important is like really key. And I think gesturing to what you were saying about these very entrenched gender norms about what kind of appropriate play or appropriate careers look like, I guess I see like kind of two paths where I think intervention is really important. I think first kind of making sure that there's a big range of structured interventions across all different stages and chapters of STEM engagement. Because I think from the work I've done with tech companies, often there can be a really big focus on the initial recruitment of people who are marginalized in the workforce, but there often is maybe less attention to thinking about how are people getting upskilled and promoted, are people being retained in that organization, is there the creation of a culture that makes people want to stay, or is it that actually once you're through the door, you're in a place that maybe, you know, wasn't necessarily made for you, and that you think, I can't really flourish or thrive here. So I think having that kind of structure set and recognizing that change has to come all the way through. I think the other thing that I think is really important is not just sort of where the intervention happens, but who is the target of it. 'Cause I think, again, a lot of stuff can be very, very targeted specifically at women, which is great and wonderful and necessary. I also think a lot of the work that we do around communicating STEM subjects has to be around also challenging our ideas of masculinity in the way that, you know, these deeply encoded gender norms also can lead men to see, you know, certain careers as being primarily for men. And so I think trying to think about how we can like more fundamentally transform these ideas about STEM for people of all genders is really crucial.
I totally agree with my panelists. I just add one additional point in terms of the when do we need to intervene. I certainly don't want today's 3-year-olds to grow up with the sort of gender norms that reflected on that hard hat slide, but at the same time I don't have the patience to wait for today's 3-year-olds to be in the workforce, and the workforce of 2030 is largely, well, left full-time education some time ago. So I think that in engineering, and I would argue in academia, although I think a lot of people don't agree with me, that we need to open our minds to the idea that you can transition successfully in careers at different points. So if you think about medicine or accountancy or law, it's very normal to do these as second careers or third careers. In engineering and maybe in academia, people sort of seem to feel you've missed the boat if you were 14 and made the wrong decision, which is just patently ridiculous. And so tech's been quite good at kind of giving people ramps to get into tech careers at different stages. And there was a brilliant program of masters to increase the number of skilled people with machine learning and AI capabilities, where bursaries were provided for underrepresented groups, so anybody could participate, but you got an extra kind of, the friction was removed if you're from an underrepresented group. Just, you know, interventions like this are practical things that we can do, and we will change the diversity of our workforce much more quickly by taking those more seriously. And then just really briefly, if I can, on your point around the narrative, like if I said, describe, you know, which career is a high social impact, team-based career, all about solving people's problems, would you say engineering? Well, you might, Megan. I hope you would. But I think a lot of people who have no exposure to engineering, that wouldn't spring to mind. And so I think we're all part of trying to upgrade that kind of popular narrative, which at the moment I just don't think does justice to the reality of these careers for anyone, whatever your background, whatever your gender, whatever your protected characteristics.
Something that I've been very fortunate to have in my career is a lot of male mentors who have been very supportive of me. And I kind of want to maybe touch on a bit like what you see as the role of men. And even though obviously you haven't had very many male panel members on this meeting, but on the role of men in improving the diversity in STEM.
Yeah, absolutely, and I could really talk about it all day. So I'll try not to. But yeah, just looking around the room, I think the men who turned up here, we should really be grateful to have you, and the importance of allyship in this challenge, the importance of having allies on your way that are representing the 85% of the industry, you know, going in, hearing a lot of that language around fighting for inclusion and overcoming obstacles. When I was entering my career as an engineer, I was a little bit anxious. I actually read a book on like the things women should do, they shouldn't do, and I came in, and I was lucky that I landed in the right company, because really after half year I just stopped noticing I'm different, and I think that's their feeling of equality and inclusion. You just stop noticing that you're different, and having these great mentors that not from a patronizing side, but creating that environment around you, making sure that they level the playing field for you to speak up, calling out people who interrupt you. and sometimes asking for your opinion when you're still a little bit shy and all coming out. That can really change it. And another powerful reason for it is psychologically, we tend to take influence more from people we relate to. And I strongly believe that a single man can influence men more successfully than a full room of women can. Really, I don't think we need many more policies. I don't think we should fight anything. The fight will give you a new policy. The fight will give you a change in behavior, but it won't change the thinking. And it's the thinking that's the root cause for unconscious bias. It's the thinking that still prevails.
I guess I would approach it from the other direction. In my work in Athena Swan, I think it sounds exhausting trying to change people's minds. I'd much rather change the structures around such that the way when people have some kind of bias, that kind of doesn't matter anymore, because the structures are in place such that that can't sort of affect the results. So maybe that's like something people talked about earlier was including more women on long lists for jobs and making sure you're kind of reaching out. So yeah, I think there's like a balance between putting into place practical things that don't require people to change their minds, and then also changing their minds.
We're not going to have that debate now. We have limited time, of course. I think these kind of approaches can build up tension and friction in some individuals that perhaps aren't as confident in their abilities, and they can see these structures and policies as threats. But let's move on.
Do you have any views on this topic, like on the role of men and how to change structures in?
Yeah, I mean, huge questions. And again, I want to caveat with the fact that I, did not previously have like a tech or an engineering career, but my anecdotal evidence from, I did a very large study with multinational tech companies. We interviewed about 60 to 65 of their employees, asking them all these questions about inclusion, diversity, and its impact on design. And I think one of the things that was not maybe a major focus of the study, but really stood out to me, is that very few of the male engineers or data scientists were actively hostile or really against the idea of having more women in the workforce. It's just a lot of them didn't really notice or didn't really think that there was going to be a problem, or didn't really understand maybe why there weren't many women in their particular team. Or they just didn't notice. They'd say, oh yeah, we have a really diverse, gender equal team. And you'd say, well, how many women are on your team? And they'd say, 1. And you'd say, oh, okay, how many people on your team? 20. Okay, that's actually not a very gender equal team. So I think a lot of very helpful starting point, I think, is I was really encouraged to see male allies and advocates in that organization who just started that conversation about saying hey, what do we prioritize when we next hire? How do we make sure we're building a culture where we notice and we make changes and we improve, rather than just kind of being yep, I'm great, everything is great.
Just really briefly, I mean, I think it's impossible to make progress in a profession which is as male-dominated as engineering without engaging men. It's physically impossible. And for us, inclusion is the hook. Inclusion is actually about creating a culture in which every single person can thrive. Of course, today we're talking about gender, but we're all composites of a whole range of different characteristics. And there are lots of aspects of policies and cultures that will impact on certain groups of men or certain individuals in ways that aren't favourable today. And so the idea of working towards inclusive cultures where you have a better opportunity to attract, retain and get the best out of talent just has to be a sensible thing. But I do think it's very important to make things practical. There's a lot of, I think, willingness that people don't always know how to enact in a practical way. And it is important that, we don't make this about sort of censoring, you can't say that, you can't do that. It's also showing, well, how can we all contribute towards making this something that we will all in turn be proud of?
I think I would quite like to ask for some questions from the audience. Do people have other microphones at the ready? Are there any questions people have? I think there's some from the sixth formers.
Hi, Hi, so I'm Helen. I'm an engineering manager. I was at Murray Edwards or Newhall many years ago. I guess my experience of kind of engineering and understanding how to get inclusion up in the department I ran was by looking outside at a different organisation, and for me it was the ambulances. I'm a public governor, and the chair there was exceptional and created a culture that made so much difference to people in terms of being heard, and that whole piece around confidence that we talked about earlier. She made a space where people could feel happy to say things that they didn't know, or that maybe that they were inexperienced in. And to see that in action is really powerful. So I could then learn from that to take it back into my organisation and sort of bring it from the bottom up rather than from the top management down. And I just wonder if there's a place in engineering for looking outside and picking up best practices to help change perceptions and images and stuff.
Definitely.
Would any of you like to respond to that?
I can have a go if you. I think it's a really, really great point, and I hope it is happening to some extent. I mean, I think we have to look outside engineering to find the answers, because within engineering we've taken a long time. But what I can also say is you can look at one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, where have we got proof that engineering can transform itself? And we actually looked at health and safety. And I think the notion of psychological safety is a very good bridge between health and safety and diversity and inclusion. And there, because it's so easy, it's so tangible, and so easy for people to relate to why health and safety is vital for an organisation. If you then try and connect that with diversity and inclusion through, for example, creating psychological safety for people to speak up and to call out concerns, not have a walk on bike culture, all that sort of stuff. Those are good little bridges that we can build. But I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I could comment on the leadership point that you raised. Really, the idea of empathic leadership, meaningful working relationships, authenticity at work, authentic leadership, and not faking it, not the command and control kind of leadership, is something that's a very strong theme in the 21st century leadership education. And interestingly, it was actually Warren Bennis, a very known researcher in the world of leadership, one of the pioneers. He noticed in the beginning of 21st century, and he commented on that in some of the books, that the very same behaviors women leaders are told to suppress, men are told to discover and learn, and the same behaviors that men are told to dial down a little, women are told to imitate. So it's like an education and leadership for women was slightly lagging behind, and instead of recognizing these strengths, it was kind of trying to paint them as weaknesses. But really, the importance of empowering your team, showing that and saying that you don't know, and that perhaps it's more complex than we thought, and showing that kind of weakness are the new ways that can be the women leadership superpower.
All right, so I really hope I'm not opening a huge can of worms.
Oh, we love can of worms.
But the changing structure versus changing perspective argument, I feel like the halfway house that is actually more important is to actually enforce the structure that we currently have, and therefore in some ways change perspective through that. So things that we have collectively agreed are wrong, things like sexual harassment and just general harassment within the workplace, should be there should be enforced punishments for all of it, because I know in a lot of places there aren't. But I feel like that should be across the board. And if we treat the simple things that everyone decides are wrong, and things like interrupting people in schools, if everyone is told off for that, and there are set punishments that are actually enforced, by doing that, arguably you are both using the structure to make a safer environment in which people can take steps, but also starting to change perspective, because people are beginning to realise things are wrong because they're actually being punished for it, rather than just getting a slap on the wrist and told don't do that again and not changing anything.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you here. We need consistency, and we need these processes. And sometimes the structure and the processes are actually benefiting much wider group of people than for whom they were intended to. Look, for example, at the lower. Good example from engineering actually is the lower curbs on the pavements. They were there for their disability and people using wheelchairs, but actually they're helping mothers and fathers with transport, yeah, and they're also helping the cyclists when they have to cross the road. And you're actually finding that maybe things like having policies around not interrupting others in lectures and you know, having strict rules about that are going to benefit other people too. And yeah, we absolutely need them. My point was that we should really focus on making men, those who maybe are a little bit more anxious about it, and those who consciously or subconsciously know that they're just not as good, and they can't be covering it up the whole way. Making them understand that this is not a competition, that this is benefiting everybody, and making them understand the experience, you know, because quite commonly they can be like, but you've got this, you've got, you know, the quotas, you've got the discrimination policies, you've got the positive action, you've got all of this, what more do you want? Well, let me just describe you what happened here. How would it make you feel? Because one thing that I loved about the EDI program with Royal Academy of Engineering, it's a program that Royal Academy of Engineering is running for the first time to increase inclusivity and diversity and equality in engineering. And my company got on that program, and I'm leading the project within my company. But on the first workshop, everybody was brought in, and you could see 50% are middle-aged white men, and that's not a bug, that's a feature. They're the ones who really understand their role here, and they're the ones who have equal power to drive the change. And the first question we were going around the room, and the leaders of the training said, introduce yourself and describe a time when you didn't feel included. And you could see people who, you know, you think they have it all, and they're saying, well, I'm Scottish and I've got a strong accent, and sometimes when I speak on meetings, people make fun of me. And another person saying, well, you know, I don't have a university degree and I built myself up from engineering, and people talk about what did you study, and then I have to say, you know, and people who you would immediately put in a box of talking from a position of entitlement actually can relate to the feeling of not being included, and resonating with these people saying, look, this happens to you sometimes, but to me, like, you know, it happens every day. Can you understand that? And can you see that? They can. Yeah, the men are growing more and more emotionally intelligent, and there is research backing that up. And yeah, they do actually have feelings, even though they, and so they can feel what you're feeling, and building that deep level understanding is what really will drive permanent change, I think.
There's in the front.
Hello, I'm Jacqueline. I was a PhD student in astronomy at what was Newhall a very long time ago. I was looking at what the title of this session is, How to Promote Brilliant Science Careers to Women, and I picked up, you know, what it was saying about that many of the people now are already in education who are going to be working in the next few decades. But I was asking myself, well, who are girls at school turning to for careers advice? It's a long time since I was in school, but I sort of strongly still get the impression that schools and teachers and parents have a great deal to do with choices that their children are making, and particularly girls, perhaps even more. I don't know, but it probably applies both to girls and boys. So I think my question is, if you're going to promote brilliant science careers to women, how are you going to get through to the teachers who may not know themselves what the possibilities are, to parents who are having the say-so and are often paying the money or are greatly respected by their children?
Maybe I come back on that. You're absolutely right. So we've done research to understand how our children's or young people's decisions being taken in terms of career choices at the moment. And you're quite right that actually parents and teachers still have a big influence. So yes, social media, for example, is now a source of careers advice that most of us probably didn't use to that extent. Well, certainly I speak for myself in that sense. So we've actually adjusted the campaign to now also have messages targeted at parents as well. And so, by using targeted advertising, you can really quite directly reach people. The trouble with parents is they are the general population. It's not like you can segment them in such a neat way as you can teenagers. And that's part of why we've taken the view that things like National Engineering Day are necessary, because it's really about just getting the message out. I mean, I think grandparents probably are influencers as well. Getting the message out more broadly. And I'm being quite unashamed about my emphasis on engineering in this context, because in the context of gender, the challenge we have is specific to attracting engineering, people into engineering, computing and technology. And so, I do think when it comes to marketing, you've got to respect the fact that you've got to be audience-led and you've got to be specific. And there is a specific challenge that we need to overcome around engineering at the level of societal perceptions. And if I may just take this opportunity to make a slightly broader point, which is that I think one of the reasons we have this challenge around engineering in the UK, and this is to some extent a shared challenge globally, but not to the extent that people tend to believe it is. And one of the reasons that, in my view, it's UK specific is we are still prone to celebrating discovery, and someone else used the term earlier of the lone genius model of science. We don't talk about the teams that deliver change, and often we don't talk about what happens once the discovery has been made. So I don't know about other people in this room, but I learned about Alexander Fleming till I was blue in the face when I was studying biosciences, but I never heard the woman Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau, who was the first chemical engineer to produce penicillin at industrial scale, which of course was absolutely vital if this was going to be of any use to anybody. And if you think about I reflected back on my career in biochemistry after I'd spent many years in engineering and thought, it's an extraordinary. I never once was prompted by anybody in this very prestigious research institute I worked at to think about where these instruments that we all knew determined really the limit of how far we could advance our discoveries. Nobody talked about who had designed these, how they'd come into being, what the role is of the people who are then going to take the discovery and do the work to create prototypes, to create business models, to scale up production, to create logistics that go from some sort of insight into something that actually reaches a patient. And I think that until we tell a more honest story of innovation, we will always underplay the role of those that are involved in converting intellectual breakthrough into something useful. And I think that that's an area where I would ask for help from everybody in this room to just try and broaden out the narrative that we give. I think it will have a bearing on who then sees himself in these careers.
Yeah, can I jump on that from the tech perspective? It's so fascinating to hear your insights because, I think the question you raise is really crucial, which is I think often we target a very narrow demographic when this conversation has to be held more broadly. But we did a really big study where we watched, I think, over 100 science fiction films. It was a pandemic lockdown project. It really has that vibe because we wanted to look specifically at how AI scientists were portrayed on screen because we were wondering, is one of the barriers to these gendered ideas of careers sort of the cultural construction of AI scientists? And we found not only was there this very stark gender discrepancy, I think only about 8% of the AI professionals we saw on screen were women, but also that the way that these scientists were getting portrayed were, I would say hypermasculine. They definitely fit that lone genius model. We tracked things like, for example, to what extent were they portrayed as child prodigies or being intellectually so much smarter than everyone else? Did they work alone? You know, and this was like kind of a massive thing, as we said, like, you know, when you're not showing collaborative processes of science making, when you treat science kind of as this kind of magic process happening in one white man's brain, then like this is not going to generate sort of a more healthy or nuanced picture of what this career would look like.
And sorry, because you got on my hobby horse here. Val, you were talking earlier about sort of the reality, which is that lots of people who are postdocs now won't go on to progress in the way they hope. And I don't know whether other people still believe it's true, but certainly at the time that I was going through my academic career, there was definitely a sense of failure if you left academia. This was the highest status thing you could do. And that, if I may be so bold to say, intellectual snobbery is very damaging, because it creates a hierarchy in terms of which jobs are valued and what you feel is a successful career. And to me, it's extraordinary, and I don't believe it's inevitable. And I think that, you know, if we can, within academia, from the start of people's journey, talk about that world of opportunity out there and celebrate all the people in this ecosystem that actually make science useful to the world, we'd be helping to just reduce some of these barriers in terms of perceptions and feelings of self-worth that do come into play. For years after I left academia, I also felt like I wanted to say, I didn't leave because I wasn't good enough, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, sorry, just chip in. Yeah, just to say the importance of failure, embracing failure. You know, I didn't get funding for the PhD. I wanted to stay. I wanted to stay at Cambridge, do a PhD, got the offer, didn't get the funding. Yeah, it's just remarkable that the things that make you cry on the shower are then a few ways later the best things that happened in your life. This is the best failure in my life that put me out into industry and made me realize that academia would be something I would absolutely despise.
So I should feel like I should jump in here and say, absolutely, I totally agree. I think, I mean, academia is weird, and and you get told this story that there is just this linear career path. And I remember as an undergraduate going to...
Megan was my DOS, so she had me going through this, yeah.
Yeah, but I remember going to a careers event as an undergrad and having all of these people, successful STEM graduates kind of standing up, and none of them had linear careers. Mm-hmm. Like, all of them had done all these different interesting things and got something different from each of those roles. And I think you lose sight of that a bit in academia, because in academia it does tend to be a bit more linear, but I don't think that's a good thing. Any other questions?
Hello, my name's Saskia. I work in higher education access and outreach. It was recently reported in the press that a head teacher had appointed an AI robot as an advisor, and I wondered if the panel could explore a little bit more about the role of AI and big tech in this particular space about promoting science careers to women.
Gosh,
I feel like
No, I think this is a really interesting question. I feel like the answer I'm going to give is going to be very long and winded and maybe not very straightforward. And just to be clear, like, a lot of my work very specifically looks at how AI can exacerbate and entrench different kinds of inequality. So my view might also be a lot more negative than someone who is more of an AI optimist. And I guess like my concern is, I think there's a ground level concern to do with the way that the AI broadly, I don't know if it makes sense to talk about AI as like one industry, but let's say like computing and software engineering like are already kind of quite gender inequitable careers in the US and the UK. As you mentioned, it's very different in other parts of the world where there is just much better gender representation, I think. So you already, I guess, like kind of have like a grounded inequality that does affect, I think, the design of products and how they're made. I think that you can particularly see it, or one area I look at, for example, is smart home tech and sort of how gendered ideas about cybersecurity like make these products quite vulnerable to forms of hacking and abuse. So, for example, the use of smart home tech for domestic abuse. And I think this is something where like it's just really important to like grapple with the fact that this industry isn't very diverse and that can have like massive impacts. On the other hand, I'm also quite interested though in how like the rollout of AI tech in this area can often be sold as something that's really going to help diversity, but I think sometimes actually hinders it. So again, another area I look at is AI recruitment software, which is often sold as like, this is something that's going to help bring more women into these industries because it's going to assess candidates neutrally, it's going to remove bias from the hiring process. And yeah, just to be transparent, I don't think those tools can do that. I'm not against the use of AI like in recruitment, but I'm really against kind of the promises that some of these companies make about their tools. And so yeah, I worry a little bit that we're seeing kind of all this momentum going towards saying we really recognize that the lack of diversity in AI is a problem, but we're trying to use tools that themselves kind of like actually narrow our focus and produce sort of more homogenous outcomes, supposedly in the name of increasing diversity. I don't really know if that made much sense. And those are two like quite specific examples. But I think the question you've raised is really fascinating. I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
I pretty much covered it. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, you know, it is of absolutely vital importance that we do have people from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, groups in society engaged in the development of transformational and disruptive technologies like AI. We know the premise, but we've actually got to be a bit more practical about how we're going to make that happen. And so I hope that at the moment there's a kind of big focus around the AI summit. I was at the Prime Minister's speech this morning. I hope we get the other side of that and we'll be able to give this some serious attention because we have made useful interventions in the past, but the result is not good enough yet. And the big tech companies have to be partners in that journey.
Hi. I think it's great that we're having these discussions on how to promote more women into these science and STEM careers. However, I find that more often than not, the STEM side that's promoted most, especially to young women and girls, is the medicine and biological sciences side of STEM. And I think a big part of that is because lots of people don't actually know what engineering is. And it comes from the whole hard hat, Google search vision that we have been given since we were young. So I just wanted to ask the panel and like maybe even the people in the audience, how do you define engineering, either like a scientific way or based on your own experiences?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Engineering, there are all these branches like civil, mechanical, electrical, but just the diversity of roles that you can have carrying an engineer title within an engineering company, that's something that I had no idea about when I was going into it. Even as a student, I started off doing physics, then I did 2 years of engineering. And as a student doing engineering, I thought that, well, it's just going to be me and my computer for the rest of my life. And so for people who enjoy the relationships, enjoy the communication, this can, well, be a little bit boring, like the first Google search that appeared in the presentation. It's not, and you're right. I think having more outreach, my company is actually doing some of that, giving us volunteering days to go to schools and talk about, well, see, this is how my day looks like. This is all the people that I'm talking to solve these problems. And yeah, we're doing some things on the computer. And as a subject matter expert, you can work mostly on your own, communicating minimally. And then the other extreme is the engineering manager, who will pretty much have a full week of meetings, just trying to make sure things are getting done and people communicate the way they should. And yeah, just maybe focusing the narrative more about just the diversity of roles within one company that I think ARM was doing very, very well actually on their program that they were running through Gateway, the speed dating with the employees. I remember going to that and I was thinking, well, like, they're all in the same company, but they're all really, really different experiences of what being an engineer is.
I'm happy to go. I mean, if I can't define engineering, then I should probably just go home. So there are two simple definitions that we use. One is engineers make things, they make things work, and they make things work better. And engineers use scientific and mathematical knowledge to solve people's problems. And then, of course, what's really important is you then bring that to life with examples, because those sound quite dry, but when you start, I'm not going to rehash my talk, you've heard enough from me, but when you start thinking about medical examples, you start thinking about disaster relief, you start thinking about AI, there are so many different ways you can describe that climate challenge. But honestly, this is engineering videos. That's exactly what we're trying to do, Ariana. So if you look at those and think, well, these don't answer my question, let me know. I want to hear from you.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that really quickly, I'm not going to try and define engineering as someone who's 100% not an engineer. That would be very a bit of a stretch for me. But I think this question is like so important. And I was really lucky when I was about 17 to go in kind of like a science camp in the summer because I was a very cool kid. But like the whole kind of purpose of the science camp was because they said, we know probably every one of you here like really loves something about the sciences, and that you probably all have your sights set on being a medical doctor because that's the only science career you've ever seen and the only science career that you think, a STEM interested person's going to do. And the point of this 2 weeks is just to show you there are a lot of things that you could be doing. So we did everything from food science to robotics through the chemistry, and and I think that like that was a really helpful process for a lot of people to say there's so much more out there. And like AI really struggles with this narrative problem because it can, it's such a loaded concept. It can mean so many different things. And so a lot of the work that I do around public communications is just trying to get people a bit more kind of easy access again to thinking about like what would it actually mean to work in this field, and like what kinds of huge diversity of skills are required in different roles here.
And two other things that the market research showed us were, firstly, that people don't want to think about Elon Musk as their role model. They want to think about somebody they can actually relate to in the sort of few years after they might graduate. And secondly, that they actually want to understand what is the reality of doing the job. Because I think what you tend to see is that, certainly anecdotally, I can say a lot of women in engineering knew an engineer. They had an uncle or a grandfather or a father or knew somebody. And I think people have difficulty visualizing what does it mean to do that job. So that's some of the content we're trying to draw out now in this engineering is just, here's an insight into my day, my week, my month from real early career engineers, user-generated content. Thank you.
Oh, we got a question down the front from someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Just down the...
Jess.
Yeah, Jess.
It's Jess.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing panel, and Hayaatun, your talk was absolutely incredible. I was just so excited. I wondered just not, and straying away from the title, and I'm sorry, but I know the Royal Academy of Engineering has done so much to try and improve diversity and inclusivity amongst engineers, particularly on kind of fellowship applications. Since bringing in this caveat that departments can put forward an extra candidate if they're from a historically marginalised group. And then they're judged equally compared to the other candidates. Has that diversified who becomes a fellow, just adding that kind of opportunity?
Thanks, Jess. I didn't plant this question. So just, it's kind of slightly specific, but it's into the practicalities of what can you do, like using the levers in your control, what can you do to try and make change happen faster? So our research fellowships, they're our earliest career fellowship. We're always oversubscribed, so universities are capped in the number of applications they can submit. And what we say is if you submit from you can have an additional place, if you like, if you submit candidates from underrepresented groups. But it's quite important to say that you have to define those in a way that is defensible. So it's not just, well, we look around and see it. We've got to have a sort of data-driven approach to identifying underrepresented groups. And what I think is as important is, in terms of changing behaviour, is that it signals to university how much we care about it. So it's not just about the fact that you hope some additional people will come through from underrepresented groups, but you're putting down a more concrete intervention than simply saying, well, please, everybody, can you try and find your best candidates from underrepresented groups? And we're trying other things like access mentoring. So access mentoring is available, again, to people from these underrepresented groups who can then get to speak to somebody who already is very familiar with the scheme ahead of applying. They then go in with everybody else. But where you're doing this, for example, to try and get more applications from non-Russell Group universities. And all of these things, it's quite hard at the scale we run to be certain of causation, But what we can say is we do have a better representation of, for example, women in our fellowship schemes than in the wider population. We have now had some really challenging times at the upper end, for example, industry-academia collaborations, where we're seeing universities consistently submitting no women, and we're getting to the point where we're considering saying you will not be able to submit any further applications unless you start to submit women. So it's, we're trying to experiment, trying to gather evidence. The stuff is tricky. We've also, for our fellowship, as in the people who are elected to be fellows of the Academy, we set ourselves a target of half of all fellows to come from underrepresented groups for the years between running through to our 50th anniversary in 2026. We've done 2 years of this, and we've met our target, and we're trying to keep going. So it's not only about women, but it's, again, sending a really clear message to people that we are serious about this. This is not a nice to have. So much still to do, but we're trying hard. Thanks, Jess. One's in the front. There's a...
Yes.
Megan, there's one in the front who's been asked.
Oh.
You've been talking about increasing the numbers of fellows you have that are diverse. How do you tackle the fact... So you were going for a specific statistic of how many of your fellows are from minority groups. How do you tackle the fact that because of sort of prejudice and disadvantages through secondary education and A-levels and applying to university, there are already a lower percentage of minority groups. So how do you prevent yourself from falling into the horrible, we're trying to meet a quota and therefore accepting this person, even if subconsciously based on the fact that they are a minority, rather than their actual merits? And the other thing, was how are you reaching out to people who are, so for instance, a lot of your stuff is online. How are you reaching out to the people who are in situations where they don't have access to that? Sorry, I'm aware that's two things I've given you.
So at the Academy, we have the good fortune to be in a position where we are really making elite awards, so we will always have more eligible people, more people who meet, if you like, the quality threshold than we're able to appoint, whether that's for fellowship, as in fellowship of the Academy, or for a research grant holder. And so we have the luxury of being able to say that if we can simply make sure that we get enough people from underrepresented groups who are in the right quality band, then there is a legitimate basis if we can show they're underrepresented for positive action. They need to all have attained a certain threshold for excellence. And so I think it's a little bit different from some other situations. So I am confident. I feel it's taken us so long in academia to be comfortable with the idea that diversity and excellence are not in opposition. There's not some tension between the two of them. I find it extraordinary that we truly believe that excellence is prevailing when you look at the lack of black professors. I mean, who wants to stand up and say that is a product of a system that always prioritizes excellence? None of us, I hope. So I think we have to be confident. We have to be very careful to follow the evidence, follow the law. But I am extremely confident that by increasing the diversity of these excellent people who then take up awards or fellowships, we will actually drive further excellence. And in terms of the issue of access, online access, to be honest, most people who are at the point of being eligible for these awards would have had to have some sort of online access. So there are times when that really applies, but less so in this context.
I believe there was maybe one last question down here.
I actually have two totally unrelated comments. One, picking up on what Hayaatun said about an engineering career and its variability. My first degree was in structural and civil engineering, in which a large part of it was actually fluid dynamics and gas dynamics. I then did a PhD in physics, and there are all sorts of reasons for that, but I had originally wanted to build bridges, and it was clear that when I did my degree, that was a futile dream for a woman, because it was considered bad luck for a woman to go onto a major building site, and men would lay down tools. So I did a PhD in physics, which was basically solving the Schrodinger equation with a boundary totally different. decided that I really wasn't happy in that and wanted to go back to something sort of like building, had become very interested in astrophysics, thought astrophysics, whereas you weren't building it, you were having to figure out from very little evidence how it had been built and take it apart. Ended up with a long and successful career, ending up in Cambridge and being appointed to the faculty. And then I was very ill at some point and thought it was the last couple of years of my life, and this was about 20 years ago. And I thought, I want to have fun. You know, I've had enough of the struggle and I've been doing women's things. And I went back to engineering because I had done my own house. I had people requesting what to do. And for the last 20 years, and I obviously survived the illness, thanks to Adam Brooks. And more recently, I've been grandma in a hard hat on a big building site, waving in a lorry and saying, I'm in charge of this site. Oh, there. So just, you know, pointing out that this sense that engineering or science degrees can open opportunity because, of course, as I say, as an engineer, I became interested in fluid dynamics. Yeah. I ended up doing that in my astrophysical research. So it came back. On a completely different topic, what you're saying about men, in 1985, there was an International Astronomical Union meeting in India, and the quasar, astrophysics, was in Bangalore. And I was in charge of the session on the study of the center of the galaxies. And very deliberately, but I very carefully looked at each of the topics that we wanted to cover. And I looked very critically at who were the leading people in the world on that subject. And if there was a woman, I chose the woman. So I convinced a very prominent astrophysicist from Mexico to chair the meeting. She thanked me for it afterwards because she was scared to death and said, I can't do it. And I said, yes, you can do it. And I had 4 women speakers and 1 man. It was completely fair. The thing that was striking was afterwards, a couple of men, and one in particular, came up to me and said, Judith, that was the most important thing that you have ever done for women. Because for the first time in my life, I knew what it was like to be in a minority. I was suddenly listening to the experts in the field, all women. And it felt strange to be a man in the audience. And I think that we didn't have to make a point. We didn't have to agitate. And then all of us got dressed up in saris for the dinner.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that. And I think it's time to wrap up. And thank you very much to all our panelists.